In today's video, we're going to be talking about leaseback agreements. Now, for anybody who may already be familiar with the term, it typically is something where maybe parents are looking to pass on assets, buy a property for children, and do it in a leaseback agreement way. Today, we're going to be running through what it is and what your other options may be with a real case we've been working with here at Cameron James. So this morning, I have Nathaniel Jacobs, who's joining us all the way from Yorkshire. Good morning, Nathaniel. How are you?
Morning. Yes, not too bad, thank you, Dominic. How about yourself?
Very well, very well. How's the weather this morning? I can see out your window, looks slightly drizzly.
Yeah, a little bit miserable. We had a bit of sunshine for about 2 weeks, and now we're back to the status quo.
All right, very good. So, Nathaniel, tell me about this client case you're working on, where the leaseback agreement originally came up for from your client, and then what's kind of transpired since then.
Yeah, so it was I was speaking to my clients on annual forward planning meeting, which we do on a biannual basis here at Cameron James, and what came up was the fact that their parents had moved. They were the parents are the clients, and then their children join in on the call, which is brilliant as well. I really appreciate when the family gets involved with the financial planning, so everybody has a good understanding of where we're at. And one thing that had come up was that they've recently moved. The parents were living with a daughter, looking to buy a house closer to the family. Getting into the later stage of retirement, they want to be close to the family. And they'd mentioned, is there any inheritance tax friendly way of doing this? They suggested to me, could they give us the cash and then buy the property and then our parents live in it? So I thought to myself, that's a really intelligent thing to think, trying, especially when the inheritance tax rate is 40%. And effectively what they were describing is what's called a leaseback agreement. And this is where you pass on the asset, as you've already mentioned, you pass on the asset and then your parents would live in the property. They pay you what's a market rate of rent, and they can effectively mitigate IHT by creating what's called a PET, partially exempt transfer. And if you survive 7 years, that asset would then fall outside of your estate for inheritance tax purposes. So effectively saving on this property in particular, it was £800,000. So 40% of £800,000, which is a substantial saving. So they wanted to explore that and see what their options were. That was it pretty much.
So how did things progress from there? Did you get in touch? What happened from there? What other options were you able to potentially suggest to them?
Yeah, so we work closely with an estate planning partner here at Cameron James, and I discussed this with them. And what they suggested was, because effectively everybody gets a nil rate band in the UK, so they suggested making sure that we're utilising the allowances first. The nil rate band is £325,000 per person, which is transferable, and the residence nil rate band is an extra £175,000 per person as well. So in this particular case, they had £1 million worth of allowances to use, an £800,000 property, and then roughly £500,000 in investments. So what they suggested was, rather than focusing on the property and doing this leaseback agreement, that we should focus on the investments instead and making sure that they're wrapped in the most tax efficient manner.
Okay, understood. And how did that, have you gone back to the client yet with kind of like this, the client and their children with this potential other option, or you're still in the research stage?
Yes, I've gone back to the client with this information so far, and they've agreed that that they should focus on the investments rather than the property, based on the fact that they've got these allowances and some of the drawbacks involved with the leaseback agreement as well.
And just to go into more detail, what would be some of the drawbacks of a leaseback agreement? I know there's some different tax implications and about whether it can be exempt or not. What are some of the drawbacks potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the leaseback agreement is a valid way of planning. However, you think there's quite a few different drawbacks. Firstly, the residence nil rate band. So if they're to pass over a property and it's to fall outside of their estate for inheritance tax purposes, they'll lose the residence nil rate band. The residence nil rate band is £175,000 that can be passed on to direct descendants in the form of a residential property. So that means that you can either pass your house to your children or grandchildren. So if they were to do the leaseback agreement, they would lose that £350,000. That's for the husband and wife, which is effectively £140,000 in tax savings. That's one drawback. Secondly, you've got the children would then inherit the property. They would have control over that property. It would be their asset. So if anything was to happen, and let's say they were to get into financial difficulty, or if there was to a divorce to occur, that house that your parents are living in could then be brought into scope, in those financial or legal cases, which could cause significant, stress and inconvenience for the family as a whole. So that's another drawback as well. Capital gains tax. So once they take that property once the children are gifted that property, if the parents wanted to downsize from an £800,000 4-bedroom house, then they would the children would actually incur capital gains tax at the marginal rate. One of them is a higher rate taxpayer, so you'd be looking at 24% tax on that if they were looking to downsize. If they were to do the leaseback agreement as well, they would have to pay the market rate of rent. So that means that the parents would have to pay the market rate of rent to the children, which means that the market rate of rent would be taxed at the marginal rate of the children, as I've mentioned. One's a higher rate, one's a basic rate, so you're still going to be getting 20% and 40% as well at tax. And then as well, it could, if it's not structured correctly, it can be classed as a gift with reservation. So what HMRC is look at it and they say is, we can see what you're doing here. You're trying to pass the asset down and still benefit from it at the same time by living there. So the asset will still fall in your estate for inheritance tax purposes. So that could cause a nasty surprise later down the line.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good example of how there's financial planning and then there's tax advice, and it's a very close line at times. But here at Cameron James, as you'll see in any paperwork from us, we are not tax advisors, and we always make that clear with our clients, but we always ensure that when clients have something which is more complicated like this, that we are working with our tax and our estate planning partner to ensure the information we're giving them is correct. So what's the latest on this case at the moment then? Your client and their children are considering to go down this route, and how would you kind of describe the route from the estate planning partner as well? It's kind of more working on the trust side of things, or how's it going to work?
Absolutely, yeah. So the estate planners who we've discussed this with have suggested focusing on the investment portion. So what we can look at is they've got about 500,000, 160k is sat in at the moment in a pension, 340,000 sat in cash ISAs earning between 3 and 4%. They've said focus on those areas first. So what we can look at is investment and trust linked solutions. So looking at either a bond or a GIA, a general investment account, wrapped inside a trust. That way you can move it out as a partially exempt transfer into a trust. So it wouldn't cost you anything on the way in, as long as it's below the nil rate band. And then you can have it in the trust. It can be sat invested. And then as long as you survive the 7 years, or if it's within the nil rate band, it's fine. Then that portion of the investment will fall outside of your estate for inheritance tax purposes.
Interesting. And what's been the client's sort of outlook of that so far? They're sort of quite keen on the idea, because obviously it's very different in comparison to the initial lease agreement idea that their children had.
Yeah, and this is an important part of financial planning, is that sometimes there's two different things. There's the product and the goal. The client's goal is to reduce inheritance tax. They've come with an idea, but the underlying goal of what they're trying to achieve is to reduce their inheritance tax liability. So what we have to do is we have to look at the situation and think to ourselves, what are the priorities for the client? And from discussions, it seemed that control over the property was an important factor. And the main goal really is to reduce inheritance tax. So it's not necessary to take extra risks, as mentioned, with putting the asset into the potential firing line of a divorce or financial disputes, when the real goal is to reduce inheritance tax. So they were very happy with the solution. They're happy that this could meet their goal whilst still not losing control over the property. And there's so they're happy with the solution in the end.
Nice. And yeah, I think this is really the value of always working with professionals who know exactly what they're talking about. And here at Cameron James, underlying portfolios, investments, pension transfers, life insurance protection. Yes, we know all of the stuff and we're extremely well educated and regulated to work in these areas. But when it comes to areas such as inheritance tax planning and tax planning, we will always ensure that we are getting the quality advice that is required for our clients. So if you'd like to speak to myself or Nathaniel or anyone in the team about the potentials of a leaseback agreement in comparison to potentially looking at things from a more trust planning perspective, you can head below, find a day and a time in our diary to have a conversation. And remember, here at Cameron James, all initial consultations are free of charge. Even getting the advice out to you is free of charge unless it's the defined benefit pension transfer, which obviously has a fixed fee for the external pension transfer specialist. So you always get to understand exactly what we recommend for you to do before you decide whether you want to become a client of ours or not. So Nathaniel, thank you very much for bringing that interesting topic onto the channel, and I look forward to seeing how this progresses for your clients.
No problem at all. Cheers.
All right, and as always, take care with your UK assets.